18 years old, a missing throat, a red mark on the back of his skull that nobody can explain. Those are the three facts sitting at the center of the most contested part of the Nolan Wells case. The independent autopsy. Not the boat, not the timeline, not the arguments about who said what on the dock that afternoon. The body itself. Because when a forensic pathologist with 2 decades of experience, someone who used to run the medical examiner's office for the entire city of Washington, D.C., tells a room full of reporters that he cannot rule out foul play, that is not a rumor. That is not a theory from a comment section. That is a sentence written in a legal report, under his own name, with his own credentials attached to it. So today we are not talking about speculation. We are going page by page through what Dr. Roger Mitchell actually found. And just as important, what he could not find, because someone else got to Nolan Wells's body first. Before we continue, let us know your thoughts in the comments. What stands out to you most about this case? And if you enjoy detailed true crime documentaries, subscribe to Midnight Crime Files for more stories like this. Stay with me, because the part about his neck is going to bother you. Before we get into the findings themselves, you need to understand who was holding the scalpel, because in a case this contested, credentials matter. The independent autopsy was conducted by Dr. Roger Mitchell, a board-certified forensic pathologist with roughly 20 years in the field. He currently serves as president of the National Medical Association, the oldest and largest organization of black physicians in the country. Before that, he was president of Howard University Hospital, chief medical officer of the Howard University faculty practice, and chair of the pathology department there. And for 7 years, from 2014 to 2021, he was the chief medical examiner for Washington, D.C., meaning every suspicious death in the nation's capital passed through his office for the better part of a decade. After that, he served briefly as interim deputy mayor for public safety and justice in D.C. This is someone who has personally conducted or supervised thousands of autopsies. This is not a hired gun brought in to tell a grieving family what they want to hear. This is someone whose entire professional reputation is built on getting these calls right, because for 7 years his signature on a report could send a case to trial or close it forever. That matters, because everything that follows in this video comes from his written findings, not from speculation, not from anonymous sources, not from anyone's gut feeling about what probably happened. It comes from a formal preliminary report, dated July 19, 2026, prepared for a second, independent autopsy on the body of Nolan Xavier Wells. And here's the first thing you need to sit with. This was the second autopsy. The state of Mississippi's medical examiner had already done the first one, which means everything Dr. Mitchell found, or didn't find, was shaped entirely by what had already been done to that body before it ever reached him. Keep that in mind. It's going to come up again, multiple times, because it's the through line of this entire report. Let's start with the bare bones of the document itself, because the language matters here. The report is titled, plainly, Preliminary Report, Second Autopsy, Death of Nolan Xavier Wells. The cause of death is listed as undetermined pending investigation. The manner of death, meaning whether this was accidental, natural, a homicide, or something else entirely, is also listed as undetermined, pending investigation. The basic identifying information, Nolan Xavier Wells, 18 years old, black, male. Date of death is listed as unknown, not confirmed, not agreed upon, unknown. The second autopsy itself was performed on July 10, 2026, 6 days after Nolan was reported missing on the 4th of July, and days after his body had already been examined once by Mississippi's own medical examiner. Right there, in the opening lines of a formal medical document, is the entire tension of this case in miniature. Undetermined, pending, unknown. 3 words that should never sit comfortably next to the name of an 18-year-old. Before Dr. Mitchell could even begin looking for answers, he had to document what he was working with, and it wasn't good. The report notes that the body showed marked decomposition by the time it reached him for the second examination. That's not unusual on its own. Bodies recovered from warm water in July decompose fast, and by the time a second, independent pathologist gets access, days have already passed since the first autopsy. But it matters enormously for what comes later, because decomposition doesn't just affect how a body looks. It actively erases evidence. Dr. Mitchell performed a standard set of procedures, a coronal incision of the scalp, removal of the brain for examination, a Y-shaped incision down the torso to access the chest and abdominal organs. All standard, all expected in any competent autopsy. He also documented something that upset a lot of people watching the press conference live, that the internal organs, once examined, are typically placed back inside the body cavity so that when a family buries their loved one, the remains are complete. But because this was going to be a second autopsy, the organs weren't sewn back into place the normal way. They were kept loose in the cavity, specifically so the second pathologist could access and examine them directly. To be absolutely clear here, because this detail visibly shook people in that room, that is standard forensic procedure. It is not a violation. It is not disrespect. It is how second, independent autopsies are physically possible at all. If you've seen clips online of people gasping at this part, that's the context you need. It's routine, not evidence of anything sinister. What is not routine, and what Dr. Mitchell flagged as one of the central limitations of his entire examination, is something else entirely. And this is where the case takes a sharp turn. Here is the detail that should stop you in your tracks. When Nolan Wells's body arrived for the second independent autopsy, the anterior, meaning front-facing, internal neck structures were not there, not damaged, not decomposed beyond recognition, simply absent, not received with the body at all. Specifically, the trachea, the laryngeal cartilage, the thyroid horn, and the hyoid bone. If those last two terms don't mean much to you, here's why they matter more than almost anything else in this entire case. The hyoid bone is a small, horseshoe-shaped bone that sits in the front of your neck, just under your jaw, and it's one of the single most important pieces of evidence in any case where strangulation is even a remote possibility. If someone is strangled or choked with significant force, the hyoid bone frequently fractures. If it's intact, that's meaningful information too. Either way, it's often the single physical structure a forensic pathologist looks to first when asking one specific question. Was pressure applied to this person's throat before they died? And in Nolan Wells' case, that structure, along with the surrounding trachea and cartilage, simply wasn't there for the second pathologist to examine. Dr. Mitchell was careful, and I want to be equally careful relaying this, not to accuse anyone of hiding evidence. What he said, in his own words in the report, is that it is assumed the initial pathologist, the one who conducted the first autopsy in Mississippi, retained those structures for additional evaluation. He went on to explain that retaining the anterior neck structures during an initial autopsy is, in his words, a common forensic pathology practice. Having served as chief medical examiner in Washington, D.C. for 7 years himself, he noted that if there had been any concern about a fracture or compression injury to the throat, retaining that tissue for closer study is exactly what his own office would have done too. In other words, this isn't necessarily suspicious on its face. Retaining tissue for further testing is a documented, normal part of forensic pathology. But, and this is the part that matters for where the investigation goes next, Dr. Mitchell was explicit that without being able to examine those structures himself, he could not complete a full evaluation of Nolan's neck. His conclusion, stated directly in the report, a posterior neck dissection performed without review of the anterior neck structures is incomplete. Therefore, he wrote, he cannot rule out injury to the neck as a contributing factor or cause of death. Read that sentence again. A board-certified forensic pathologist, someone who ran the D.C. Medical Examiner's Office for 7 years, is saying in a formal written report that he cannot rule out neck injury as a cause of death, because the part of the body that would answer that question wasn't given to him. That's not an accusation. It's an open question. But it's an open question that only one party currently holds the answer to, the state of Mississippi. Now here's the second major finding, and it's the one that had people in the room audibly gasping during the press conference. During what's called a layered posterior neck dissection, essentially, cutting through the back of the neck and skull area in careful layers to examine the tissue underneath, Dr. Mitchell found something unexpected. A focal area of red discoloration, roughly 12 centimeters by 8 centimeters, located in the deep soft tissue overlying the occipital bone. If you're not familiar with that term, the occipital bone is at the very back and base of the skull, essentially the lowest part of the back of your head, right above where your neck begins. Dr. Mitchell was direct about what this could and couldn't tell him. The cause, what forensic pathologists call the etiology, of this discoloration is, in his words, unclear. There were no lacerations to the skin above it. There was no fracture in the underlying skull. Because of that, combined with the extensive decomposition of the body and the absence of other associated injuries nearby, he stated that the finding was inconclusive for what's called a premortal injury, meaning an injury that happened right around the time of death, as opposed to something that developed after death from natural decomposition processes. But, and this is the key line, he stated clearly that the finding was significant enough that it needed to be highlighted in this preliminary report for further investigation, not dismissed, not explained away, flagged. And there's one more detail buried in this section of the report that's easy to miss, but genuinely important. This finding could not have been observed during the very first autopsy, the one Mississippi's own medical examiner performed, because that first autopsy never included a posterior head and neck dissection at all. In plain terms, nobody looked at this specific area of Nolan's head until the second, independent pathologist did it, days later, on a body that was already decomposing. So think about what that actually means. This red discoloration has existed on Nolan Wells' body this entire time. It simply hadn't been checked for, because the specific procedure needed to find it, cutting through the layers of tissue at the back of the head and neck, wasn't part of the state's original examination. It would be easy, in a case like this, to focus only on the alarming findings. But part of what makes this report credible, and part of why even outside legal experts reviewing it afterward praise Dr. Mitchell's approach, is what he ruled out just as carefully as what he flagged. To check for broader signs of trauma, Dr. Mitchell performed additional dissection procedures that had not been done during the first autopsy: dissection of the face, the ribs, the pelvic region, the subcutaneous and deep soft tissue, the back, the buttocks, and both arms and legs. This was, by his own account, done specifically to rule out potential blunt force injuries that might have contributed to Nolan's death. The result of all of that additional work: no fractures, no deep tissue injuries identified anywhere else on the body. In a case already surrounded by speculation, that's not a small detail. It directly rules out a whole category of possible explanations, like a serious fall, a severe beating, or major blunt trauma to the limbs or torso. Whatever happened to Nolan Wells, based on everything Dr. Mitchell was able to examine, it does not appear to have involved widespread physical trauma to his body. That's important context, because it narrows the field. The mystery isn't, was he beaten? The mystery is centered specifically on two things: that unexplained red discoloration at the base of his skull, and the neck structures nobody has been allowed to examine yet. There's a third limitation in this report that gets less attention than the neck, but medically, it might be just as important, because it goes directly to the central question in any case involving a body recovered from water. Did this person drown, or were they already gone before they ever entered the water? Dr. Mitchell noted that because the initial autopsy had already removed and dissected the organs, again, standard, expected procedure for a first examination, there were additional limitations built into his second look. Specifically, he could not directly observe the airway and lungs for the presence of water, and he could not directly observe the stomach for its contents. Here's why that detail is so significant. If someone drowns while alive, water is typically forced into the airway and down into the lungs as the body struggles to breathe underwater. If, on the other hand, someone was already deceased before their body entered the water, that reflex never happens. The airway essentially seals, and the lungs stay dry, because a dead body doesn't gasp for air. That single distinction, wet lungs versus dry lungs, is one of the most basic foundational pieces of evidence in determining whether someone actually drowned, or whether they were placed in the water after death from some other cause entirely. And in Nolan Wells' case, because the lungs and airway had already been examined and altered during the first autopsy, that specific piece of evidence simply isn't available to the second pathologist anymore. It's gone. Whatever the original Mississippi examiners saw when they looked at his lungs, that observation belongs entirely to them. Same story with the stomach contents. Knowing what was or wasn't in Nolan's stomach and how digested it was can help establish a rough timeline. How long had it been since he last ate? And does that line up with the timeline everyone else has been telling about his final hours? Again, information that existed once, examined once, and is no longer something the second, independent pathologist can verify for himself. It's worth pausing on just how much this single limitation reshapes the entire case. In a typical drowning investigation, the condition of the lungs is often the very first thing a pathologist checks, precisely because it's one of the fastest ways to separate an accidental drowning from something else entirely. Take that piece of evidence away, and you're left leaning almost entirely on secondary indicators. Bruising patterns that decomposition may have already erased, skeletal findings that came back clean, and a scalp finding that's inconclusive on its own. None of that is anyone's fault in this specific report. Dr. Mitchell worked with exactly what he was given. But it does mean that, for now, the most direct medical evidence about whether Nolan actually drowned lies entirely inside a report the public still hasn't seen. Buried in the discussion section of the report is what might be the single most important paragraph in the entire document. And it's not about any one physical finding. It's about a concept. Dr. Mitchell wrote that in any case where a death occurs in or around a body of water with suspicion of drowning, it is critical to establish how that person entered the water in the first place. And he specifically noted that this question becomes especially important when the person in question was someone who could swim, which, by every account from people who knew him, Nolan Wells could. Was he conscious when he entered the water, or unconscious? Was he forced in, or did he enter on his own? Dr. Mitchell stated plainly that he does not know the answer to either question, and that the answer would be, in his words, the crux of the matter, not a side detail. The crux, the single piece of information that everything else in this case ultimately depends on. Because of all of this, the missing neck structures, the unexplained mark at the base of the skull, the inability to examine the lungs or stomach directly, and the total absence of any confirmed account of how Nolan entered the water, Dr. Mitchell reached his final conclusion, and it's worth sitting with the exact framing he used. He stated that for these reasons he cannot rule out whether intervening, non-accidental factors contributed to or caused Nolan Wells' death. Translated out of clinical language, he cannot rule out foul play. Not, there was foul play. Not, someone did this to him. Cannot rule out. That distinction matters enormously, both legally and ethically, and we're going to respect it throughout this video. But it's also exactly why this case is not closing anytime soon. Dr. Mitchell closed his preliminary findings with a direct list of what remains unresolved, and laying them out one by one shows you exactly how much of this case is still, genuinely, up in the air. First, what were the actual circumstances that led to Nolan entering the water in the first place? Second, what position was his body in when it was recovered? This one already has a partial answer from outside the report. A member of the volunteer search and rescue group known as the Cajun Navy has said Nolan was found face down and fully clothed. Third, whether there was water present in his airway. Fourth, whether there's any evidence of injury to the front of the neck, the very structures that were missing from this examination. Fifth, whether there's any evidence of intracranial hemorrhaging, meaning bleeding inside the skull, which would connect directly to that unexplained red discoloration at the base of his head. Sixth, what the composition of his stomach contents was, which ties back to establishing a timeline of his final hours. And seventh, the toxicology results, which had not been completed at the time this preliminary report was written. Look at that list as a whole for a second, because the pattern in it is easy to miss if you go through it too quickly. Every single one of those 7 questions has a specific, knowable answer somewhere. Somebody knows what position Nolan's body was found in beyond the second-hand account from a search and rescue volunteer. Somebody has already looked at his lungs and his stomach contents, because the first autopsy happened before the second one, and that information doesn't just vanish. It exists in a file, on a desk, in an office in Mississippi. Somebody has already run, or is running, the toxicology panel. None of these 7 questions are unanswerable in the abstract. They're unanswered publicly, right now, which is a very different thing. That distinction is the entire reason this story hasn't gone away. If these were genuinely unknowable facts, lost forever to decomposition and time, that would be one kind of tragedy, a case that stays open because the evidence itself is gone. But that's not quite what's happening here. What's happening is that the evidence very likely still exists, in the hands of the original examiners, and the public, including the family's own independent legal and medical team, simply hasn't been given access to it yet. Dr. Mitchell's official classification, given all of that, cause and manner of death, undetermined, pending investigation. And he added one more line that's worth repeating, because it shows this isn't a closed door. He reserved the right to review and incorporate additional forensic information into his opinion as it becomes available. Everything in the report, he noted, is expressed to what's called a reasonable degree of medical certainty, the standard phrasing pathologists use to indicate their findings are professional, credible conclusions, not guesses. Once the findings went public, medical and legal experts who reviewed the report echoed a lot of what's in it, but they also added context worth including here, because it helps make sense of some of the more confusing details for anyone who isn't a pathologist by trade. On the missing neck structure specifically, legal analysts who've handled autopsy evidence in court were careful to clarify one thing. Those structures aren't necessarily missing in the sense of lost or destroyed. It's far more likely that the state of Mississippi is simply still holding on to them for its own ongoing examination and hasn't released them, or its own findings, publicly yet, in part because its toxicology results also aren't finished. Under that reading, this isn't a mystery about where the evidence went. It's a question about when, or whether, the state will share what it already knows. On the medical side, physicians reviewing the case pointed out that water itself complicates every part of an examination like this. A body recovered from warm water after several days can show bloating, skin slippage, and disruption from marine life, all of which make it significantly harder to assess bruising or soft tissue injury accurately. That's part of why some of Dr. Mitchell's findings, including the discoloration at the base of the skull, are described as inconclusive rather than definitive. It's not that the finding doesn't matter, it's that water and decomposition genuinely make it harder to say with certainty what caused it. There's also broad agreement among people who've reviewed this kind of report before that the timeline here, roughly 2.5 weeks between recovery and this preliminary report, isn't unusually long for a water-related death with this many complicating factors. High-profile cases involving suspected drug involvement or unclear causes of death have, in the past, taken months rather than weeks for a final, official cause of death to be confirmed. It's not uncommon for the public to expect answers on a timeline that simply doesn't match how forensic toxicology actually works. Testing for the full range of substances at the level of precision needed to hold up in a courtroom is a slow, methodical process, and rushing it doesn't produce more reliable results. It produces less reliable ones. One physician who reviewed the case for outside commentary made a point of walking through exactly what a missing hyoid bone can and can't tell you. And it's worth including here because it clarifies a detail a lot of viewers get wrong. An intact hyoid bone doesn't automatically rule out strangulation. Plenty of confirmed strangulation cases, particularly involving younger victims, show no hyoid fracture at all, because the bone is more flexible and less likely to break in someone still that young. But a fractured or displaced hyoid bone is close to definitive evidence of significant pressure having been applied to the neck. In other words, examining that bone wouldn't necessarily clear anyone, but it could confirm serious harm, which is exactly why its absence from this second examination is such a significant gap rather than a minor technicality. The same expert also addressed a detail that came up repeatedly in the hours after the report became public: the idea that a cover-up is automatically the explanation for information being withheld this long. Her answer was more measured than that framing allows for. She noted that investigators and independent legal teams both have professional incentives to hold their findings close until they're confident in them. Nobody wants to release a partial conclusion, walk it back later, and hand the opposing side an opening to discredit the entire investigation. That caution can look, from the outside, indistinguishable from stonewalling. Sometimes it is exactly that. Sometimes it isn't. And right now, from where the public is standing, there's no way to know for certain which one this is. If you've been in the comments asking why any of this is taking so long, it helps to zoom out and look at how other high-profile cases have played out, because the answer might surprise you. Think about how long the public waited for official, final cause of death rulings in cases that dominated the news cycle for weeks. In cases where drug involvement was suspected, final, confirmed causes of death have taken a month, sometimes closer to 2 months, after the person died, even with a body that wasn't recovered from water, wasn't decomposed, and didn't have any organs already removed by a separate examiner beforehand. One well-known entertainment industry death took roughly 6 months before an official determination was finalized. And that's without any of the complicating factors present here. No competing autopsies, no missing tissue samples, no body recovered from warm water after several days in the elements. None of that means Nolan Wells' case is following a normal or acceptable timeline in every sense. The family and their legal team have made clear they believe the state should have shared basic gross findings well before now, independent of whatever toxicology still needs to be finalized. But it does mean the length of time itself, on its own, isn't necessarily evidence of anything sinister. It's the specific gaps, the neck, the lungs, the lack of any shared preliminary findings from the state's own side, that are doing the real work of keeping this story open. Time alone isn't proof. Silence about the pieces that could be shared right now, arguably, is the more relevant question. Here's what all of this adds up to, and why it matters beyond the individual details. Before this report, the public conversation around Nolan Wells' death was largely built on secondhand accounts. A sheriff's early statement suggesting it looked accidental, conflicting stories about who was on the boat and when, disputed video, and a lot of public speculation, with very little in the way of documented medical evidence. This report changes that because it's the first piece of this case that comes directly from a forensic pathologist's own physical examination of Nolan's body, described in his own formal, written findings. And what it establishes, clearly and without speculation, is this. There are at least 2 significant, unresolved physical questions: the mark at the base of his skull and the entire front portion of his neck, that nobody has yet been able to answer. Not because the answers don't exist, because the second, independent examination didn't have access to the information needed to answer them. That's not proof of anything. Dr. Mitchell himself was careful never to claim it was. But it is, for the first time in this case, a document with real medical weight behind it that says, in plain terms, this is not settled, and there are specific reasons why it isn't. So what happens next? The obvious next step is the one everyone in that press conference kept circling back to: the release of the state of Mississippi's own official autopsy findings, alongside the toxicology results from both examinations. Until that happens, Dr. Mitchell's report will remain exactly what it says it is: preliminary and incomplete, through no fault of his own. There's also the question of whether Dr. Mitchell will ultimately be given access to those retained neck structures for direct examination, which would resolve, one way or another, the single biggest open question in this entire case. And underneath all of it sits the same demand that's been present since the very beginning of this story: transparency. Not a conclusion handed down from either side before the evidence is actually assembled. Just the full picture, whatever it turns out to be. Because right now what we have is a genuinely qualified, credentialed pathologist saying on the record that he cannot rule out that something was done to Nolan Wells before he ever entered that water, and a state that, so far, hasn't shared enough information for anyone, including its own independent counterpart, to say otherwise. That's where this stands. Not resolved, not closed, undetermined, pending investigation. 3 words an 18-year-old's family is still waiting to see replaced with something more definite. We'll be tracking this one closely, because the moment either side releases more, the entire picture could shift. And that's really the through line worth remembering as this case continues to develop. A formal, credentialed autopsy report is not a rumor, and it's not a theory somebody typed out in a comment section at 2 in the morning. It's a physical examination, conducted by someone with the credentials to know exactly what he's looking at. And it says, in careful, deliberate, legally precise language, that there are questions here nobody has answered yet. Not, there's nothing to see. Not, case closed. Undetermined. Pending. Still open. For a family that has spent weeks being told their son's death was probably just an accident, before a single formal document existed to support that claim, this report is the first real acknowledgement that their questions were never unreasonable in the first place. Whatever the final answer turns out to be, accidental or something else entirely, Nolan Wells's family has earned the right to hear it stated plainly, backed by evidence, rather than assumed out loud by someone standing on a dock before the body was even fully recovered. If you want to understand exactly how we got to this point, the boat, the timeline, the disputed video from that afternoon, that's the deeper background covered in the rest of this series. And it's worth watching if you haven't already, because it's the context that makes everything in this report make sense. If you found this documentary informative, subscribe to Midnight True Crime and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. We cover the facts, follow the evidence, and bring you the latest developments in the cases that matter most. And before you go, we'd like to hear from you. What do you think is the biggest unanswered question in the Nolan Wells investigation? Let us know in the comments below, and as always, please keep the discussion respectful. The headlines may fade, but the search for truth never ends. This is Midnight True Crime. We'll see you in the next investigation.